Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known as Mark Twain.
Recently, someone in Missouri has sent me a picture of the house I was born in. Heretofore, I have always stated that it was a palace, but I shall be more guarded now.
Sam's father, John Marshall Clemens, had recently moved his family from Tennessee, settling them into the two-room frame house where Sam was born.
Florida, Missouri consisted of 60 families, 4 mercantile houses, 2 grist mills, 1 sawmill, 1 hemp factory, and several whiskey distilleries. John Clemens, already a justice of the peace, got himself appointed commissioner for both the Salt River Navigation Company and the Florida and Paris Railroad Company, with plans to bring prosperity to the town. For diversion, he worked on his perpetual motion machine.
His hopes came to naught when steamboats couldn't navigate the Salt River and railroad firms weren't interested in opening a line between Florida and Paris. Hoping to find new opportunities, John Clemens moved the family to Hannibal late in 1839, where he operated a general store and opened a law office. Although Hannibal was Sam's new home, he spent the next few summers at the farm of his uncle, John Quarles, near Florida. Memories of those visits would stay with him the rest of his life. Memories such as Uncle Daniel, a slave who became storyteller, friend, ally, and advisor to the many children in the area. Years later, Samuel Clemens used Uncle Daniel as the basis for Jim in the immortal adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
Call me Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn.
Since there were no public schools in Missouri at that time, young Sam Clemens attended a private school where the tuition terms were 25 cents per week per pupil, and collect it if you can. Although an excellent speller, Sam was not an eager student and learned more outside the classroom along Hannibal's riverfront. For Sam, like many of the village boys, the Mississippi River with its, as Sam would later call them, omnipotent riverboat pilots seemed to cast a spell on young imaginations. The dream of becoming one of those omnipotent pilots settled deep inside Sam's soul and became a permanent ambition, as he would later write.
There's a moon on the Mississippi River tonight, side-wheel steamboat making up time. Call me Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn.
When Sam's father died in 1847, Sam left school and went to work as a printer's devil, or apprentice. 2 years later, Sam's oldest brother, Orion, bought the Hannibal Journal, a local weekly, and hired Sam to work on it. When Orion went away for a week, he asked Sam to edit the paper. It was Sam's first literary effort. His editorial consisted of several uncomplimentary items about some prominent local citizens. Orion returned to find the town up in arms and 33 new subscribers to the paper. At 18, after swearing to his mother on the Bible that he would
Not throw a card or drink a drop of liquor.
Sam left home to make his own way. In the course of a year, this young man with red hair, slow speech, and a pronounced drawl worked in St. Louis, New York City, and Philadelphia. In 1854, Sam returned to his family, then living in Keokuk, Iowa, and took a job in his brother's print shop. 2 years later, he moved to Cincinnati to find better employment so he could finance a dream of his, making a fortune in the Brazilian cocoa harvest.
In the spring of 1857, Sam boarded the riverboat Paul Jones, bound for New Orleans, where he planned on boarding another ship to the Amazon. He never made it. Sam's permanent ambition to be a riverboat pilot was reawakened and he convinced the pilot, Horace Bixby, to teach him the Mississippi River between St. Louis and New Orleans for $500. In Life on the Mississippi, Twain commented that,
I suppose that all a pilot had to do was to keep his boat in the river, and I did not consider that that could be much of a trick, since it was so wide.
He soon discovered that learning 1,300 miles of constantly changing river was a formidable task. After 18 months as a cub or understudy, Sam Clemens acquired his pilot's license. Years later, Clemens fondly recalled,
I loved the profession far better than any I have followed since, and I took a measureless pride in it. The reason is plain. A pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived in the earth.
Not all of Sam's memories of his river days, however, were pleasurable. While still a cub, Sam found a position for his younger brother Henry on the steamboat Pennsylvania. Near Memphis, the steamboat's boilers blew up. Henry was injured and later died. Sam blamed himself for his death. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, commercial steamboating on the Mississippi ended, and Sam Clemens returned to his boyhood home of Hannibal to find Missouri horribly split. Even his own family had divided loyalties. Orion was a Northern sympathizer, while Sam sympathized with the South. When Union forces invaded Missouri and captured St. Louis and Jefferson Barracks, Governor Jackson put out a call to repel the invader. Sam Clemens and 14 other young men from Hannibal formed a state militia unit and named themselves the Marion Rangers. Sam was elected as second lieutenant. After 2 or 3 weeks of retreating, the Marion Rangers fell back to a camp near Florida, the town of Sam's birth. Before long, word came that a Union colonel named Grant and the 21st Illinois Infantry were on their way to destroy the Missouri militia. About half of the Marion Rangers, including Lieutenant Clemens, resigned from the militia. Almost 25 years later, he recalled,
I could have become a soldier myself if I had waited. I had got part of it learned. I knew more about retreating than the man that invented retreating.
Late in the spring of 1861, Sam's oldest brother, Orion, accepted a new appointment that would benefit his unemployed younger brother. In Roughing It, Mark Twain recalls that,
My brother had just been appointed Secretary of Nevada Territory, an office of such majesty that it concentrated in itself the duties and dignities of Treasurer, Comptroller, Secretary of State, and Acting Governor in the Governor's absence. When he offered me, in cold blood, the sublime position of Private Secretary under him, I had nothing more to desire.
what started out as a 3-month lark turned into 7 years in the West, with Sam working as a prospector, newspaper reporter, editor, and lecturer. Sam's job with his brother paid no salary, and Sam tried supporting himself with mining. Then, one August day in 1862, in response to a job offer received by mail, a worn and travel-stained Samuel Clemens entered the office of the Virginia City, Nevada Territorial Enterprise.
My name is Clemens, and I've come to write for the paper.
The next year, Clemens, still employed by the Territorial Enterprise, would first use the pen name that would make him famous, Mark Twain, a steamboating term meaning 2 fathoms, or safe water.
Under the name Mark Twain, Clemens received national acclaim for a short story printed in 1865, Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, later reprinted as The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. By this time, he was working in San Francisco, and in 1866, accepted an assignment with the Sacramento Union as a special correspondent to the Sandwich or Hawaiian Islands. Upon returning to San Francisco 5 months later, the author found himself in need of money and decided to offer a lecture on his recent trip to the islands. The bottom of the advertisement read, "Doors open at 7 o'clock. The trouble begins at 8 o'clock." He spoke to a full house, thus began a career of traveling, writing, and lecturing that would last Mark Twain the rest of his life.
Mark Twain returned to the East, where he enjoyed prestige and success as the wild humorist of the Pacific Slope. While writing letters of his travels for the Alta California, California's first daily newspaper, he learned of the steamboat Quaker City's cruise to the Mediterranean and persuaded the newspaper to pay his passage in exchange for letters of his adventures. This trip provided the basis for Twain's first full-length book, The Innocents Abroad, in which he poked fun at himself and his companions as wide-eyed American tourists. The excursion had an even more profound effect on Samuel Clemens than merely providing material for his book. When fellow passenger Charles Langdon showed Sam this photographic miniature of his sister, Olivia, Sam fell in love, and after meeting her in Elmira, New York, he asked Olivia Langdon to marry him. At first, Olivia rejected Sam's marriage proposal, but then finally agreed. Sam wrote a friend,
I have won. Refused 3 times, warned to quit once, accepted at last.
Her parents still needed to approve, as there was some concern about Sam's financial status. There was also the question of Sam's morals after living a rough life out west. Finally, Olivia's father gave his approval, and on February 2nd, 1870, in Elmira, New York, Samuel Clemens married Olivia Langdon. Livy, as Clemens called his wife, became the author's chief editor and literary critic.
The first child, a son named Langdon, was born that November, with a daughter Susie, born the following year. The couple would have 2 other children, Clara, born in 1874, and Jean in 1880. But Langdon died of diphtheria when he was 19 months old. Sam, believing that his son died of pneumonia, blamed himself for his son's death because he had failed to keep the child properly bundled during a carriage ride.
When you wake, you shall find all the pretty little horses.
As a leading humorist, Mark Twain became friends with many of the nation's best-known novelists, publishers, clergy, and financiers, including such prominent figures as the Reverend Joseph Twitchell and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Samuel Clemens was also fascinated with invention and innovation. He was among the first to use the typewriter, bicycle, and telephone. He invented a memory game, self-adhesive scrapbook, and tried to perfect self-regulating suspenders. The author also poured $190,000 into the page typesetting machine, which, despite high hopes, ultimately failed. Mark Twain also financially backed a publishing firm managed by Charles L. Webster. After turning a profit on the adventures of Huckleberry Finn and General Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, the firm folded. During the Depression of 1893, Sam Clemens was on the brink of financial disaster.
Because Europe afforded a welcome relief from these worries and reduced their cost of living, the family spent much of the 1890s abroad. Mark Twain returned to the U.S. only occasionally for business purposes. On one such trip, he was introduced to Henry H. Rogers, a Standard Oil Company executive and financier. A warm friendship developed, and Rogers agreed to straighten out the author's finances. Rogers liquidated Webster and Company assets and sold Clemens' interest in the Page Typesetter. Still heavily in debt, Mark Twain refused to declare bankruptcy and vowed to repay all creditors. Again, he took to the lecture circuit. He, Livy, and daughter Clara embarked on a year-long round-the-world lecture tour. Mark Twain spoke to full houses, hobnobbed with society, dined with royalty, and gathered materials for a new book, Following the Equator. By year's end, many of the creditors had been paid.
All hard times come again no more.
While in England, on the last stop of the lecture tour, they received word that 24-year-old daughter Susie had died of meningitis. Sam's deep grief and sorrow can be heard in the comment he later made upon seeing the last unfinished sentence in the biography Susie had been writing of him.
When I look at the arrested sentence, it seems as if the hand that traced it cannot be far. But that is a dream.
The family returned to America in 1900, free of financial burdens. And in 1902, Mark Twain made his last visit to Missouri. He accepted an invitation to attend commencement exercises at the University of Missouri, Columbia, where he was granted an honorary Doctor of Law degree. During his trip, the author stopped in Hannibal to renew old friendships, visit his boyhood home, and confer high school graduation diplomas. By this time, Livy's health was suffering, and the family sought rest and seclusion at a villa in Florence, Italy. On June 5, 1904, Olivia Langdon Clemens died.
I see thy face in every dream. My waking thoughts are full of thee.
Grief-stricken, Sam wrote to a friend.
An hour ago, the best heart that ever beat for me and mine went silent out of this house. And I am as one who wanders and has lost his way. I am tired and old. I wish I were with Livy.
Following their mother's death, Jean's epileptic seizures worsened, and Clara suffered a nervous breakdown.
The days may come, the days may go, but still the hands of memory weave the blissful dreams of long ago.
To deal with his grief, Sam tried to lose himself in his work. His popularity had never been greater. Easily recognized with his white suit, cigar, mustache, and long, unruly hair, reporters followed him about, trying to get interviews or his thoughts on the problems of the day. However, his outlook became darker, a factor reflected in his writing. In 1907, Mark Twain accepted an honorary doctorate of literature at Oxford University in England. A year later, he and his daughters moved into their new 18-room, 2-story villa named Stormfield in Redding, Connecticut. Twain's only instructions to the architect was that the house include a large billiards room, decorated in red, a living room big enough to hold his mechanical orchestrelle, and plenty of guest rooms. Twain said of the house,
I don't want to see it until the cat is purring on the hearth.
On Christmas Eve of 1909, disaster again struck. Twain's daughter Jean died of an epileptic seizure in the bathtub. Twain commented to Albert Bigelow Paine, his biographer,
Well, I suppose you have heard of this final disaster.
Just 4 months later, on April 21st, 1910, as Halley's comet once again streaked across the heavens, Mark Twain died. He was 74.
A marker in Florida, Missouri indicates the original spot where Samuel Clemens was born. The humble house of Samuel Clemens' birth had been donated to the state of Missouri in 1925 and moved a quarter-mile south to the newly created Mark Twain State Park. In 1959, the Mark Twain Birthplace Memorial Shrine was built to house the cabin as well as museum, library, and research facilities. Visitors to the shrine can view the original manuscript of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, furniture from the Hartford home, and other artifacts or exhibits that interpret the life and work of this man who touched the heart as so few authors have. In The Mysterious Stranger, an unfinished manuscript published after his death, Twain concludes with,
"There is no God, no universe, no human race, no earthly life, no heaven, no hell. It is all a dream, a grotesque and foolish dream. Nothing exists but you."
However dark the author's reflections on man's lot might have been, his writings continue to touch people the world over. Even after 100 years, his works still generate controversy, and banning of his books in schools and libraries can still be found. Nevertheless, people old and young alike continue to discover and enjoy Mark Twain's rare wit and insight. Samuel Clemens has done what few men have been able to do. He has achieved